Well, welcome to everybody. My name is Anna Neimark. I coordinate visual studies at SCI-Arc, and I'm a design faculty here at the school. And I'm joined today by 5 amazing friends, faculty, people, colleagues, and we're all going to present, well, they are each going to present an act in the Building a Blank Symposium. I'll just do a quick introduction to present a kind of positions, possible positions on the topic. One thing I should mention, of course, this is a series of symposia. There are a total of 3. We started last month with the AI symposium with Damian. This is the building symposium that we're all participating in, and the 3rd one will be, I think, a month from now on synthetic landscapes. I think David Rue is moderating that one, so we invite everybody to come back in about a month. And this is all part of the graduate thesis kind of summer programs. So welcome to all the students and welcome to everybody in the audience. One thing that I wanted to do is kind of set the terms for our discussion today. And you will see that we do not all agree on the terms or even the term building and how to interpret it. So we start with a kind of blank. The term building isn't straightforward. A building with the article in front of it is a noun. It is a fact, something finite. A building could be a monument. It is the first thing that comes to mind for anyone who thinks about what it is that we do. Buildings are the things that we're meant to be working on, period. By contrast, building with the article that follows becomes something different, something a bit more enigmatic. It is not quite a noun, but a gerund, which is ostensibly a verb turned noun, a verb that is caught in the middle of an act. A gerund is not monumental, but infrastructural. It is insufficient by itself and cannot be followed by a period. Building a ... is no longer a fact, but an action about to unfold. And it's wrapped up in all sorts of concerns. This ambiguity of building in architecture, building as object and building as process, is embedded in the word itself. To give you an example, when Jackie Bloom and I were discussing today's symposium, she sent me a course description from Bouwman College by a friend and colleague, John McMurrow, who argues for the authority of buildings. He writes that the seminar will follow buildings, but not the process of their construction, not their impact on environment, not their service to community. Instead, he argues for buildings as facts, freestanding givens. They're there, like nature in front of you. Isn't a building enough? This is one position. The building is an autonomous spatial construct. It is the core of the discipline of architecture. It is a monument and belongs to the vanguard. The architect is framed as the contemporary visionary, a time traveler from the future, a sort of god. Buildings are at the core of the discipline of architecture. But is the course required? No, it is an elective. It meets on Wednesdays at 8:30 in the morning. I wonder how many students are awake for it. Our students here who did thesis all know how to redact a text. And here I follow all of your lead by erasing the negatives with center contingencies of practice. Building, as opposed to buildings, is the process of construction. It is constituted by the extraction of materials. It has an impact on the environment. It services community. Politics, economics, environment reposition the humanist architect in an array of social forces, things we have no control over. The Tower of Babel illustrates this dichotomy, so perhaps I could title my own intro, Building a Tower. As an origin story of building, it is a cautionary tale. After the Great Flood, one tribe descending from Noah, the people of Shem, decide to build a city and a tower to reach the heavens in order to make the name for themselves. But their hubris is punished by God. The Lord says, look, they are one people, they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us come down, confuse levalbel in Hebrew, their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. The Colosseum-like tower turns to ruin, so beautifully depicted here by Bruegel. It is both a tour de force and a warning to all architects in the room. Looking closer, the monument turns infrastructural. It is not only in ruin, in fact, but a fortification in construction. The biblical story turns real as bricklayers and stonemasons labor on machines, pulleys, scaffolds. Bruegel depicts a number of technical and crafts processes across the tiers of the tower and across time, from Roman to Romanesque to contemporaneous, including a Flemish port at its base, landing Babylon in 16th century Antwerp. The biblical parable turns to contemporary politics in a city that is fortifying itself for war against France amidst a breakup of the Catholic stronghold in the northern countries. So the whole kind of Lutheran reconstruction, let's say, and the destruction of a totalizing language. Another detail is my favorite. A stack of stone offers a beautiful arrangement of heavy blocks and workers chiseling inscriptions. A perverse joke on Bruegel's part if God is about to confuse their language and scatter the people across the globe. A dolmen-like arrangement hides behind a genuflecting grouping, itself a global monument. Architects work at many scales of construction, so let's jump to another tower, the towering figure of Julia Child hovering above the WGBH kitchen counter. At her base are workers, invisible to the camera, who support her monumental performance. They hold microphones, they light the scene, not unlike the scene right now, serving up plates, cleaning up her spills. What we do not see at home are all the technologies of televisuality that bring this work surface to life. Lights, cameras, mirrors, all coordinate the scene. The reflected plan of the kitchen counter on our TV is naturalized. Julia Child's view of the stove becomes our view. We see what she sees. The soundstage can be described as a sort of construction site, albeit at a smaller scale. She defiantly holds an oversized whisk in her very large hand. What she does during the half-hour episode is bring a recipe to life. The show visualizes the cookbook step by step, meticulously live in one continuous take. The section on omelets begins with the following passage. The difficulty with all the written recipes for omelets is that before you even start to make one, you must read, remember, and visualize the directions from beginning to end, and practice those movements. For everything must go so quickly once the eggs are in the pan that there is no time at all to stop in the middle and pore over your book in order to see what comes next. Learning to make a good omelet is entirely a matter of practice. Conceived at the same time as the TV show, the book lays out the TV script in full view. Hands hold pans that come to life in front of a mass audience as if by magic. Let's take a look.
We're about to see a French omelet being made. You've just seen a French omelet made today on the French chef. The one that I just saw you was shaking the pan like this, which takes a little, as they say, tour de main. But I'm going to show you an equally professional method in which you shake the pan like this and stir it with a fork, and then unfold it.
It takes 30 seconds to make an omelet, but it takes 30 minutes for Julia Child to show exactly how to make one on the first episode of The French Chef. She describes the technique as a tour de main, the turning of the hand. Let's think of it as a little sister to the tour de force, as the power of the monument is here displaced by the expertly practiced hand. Consider both as two extremes of something that an architect is trained to do. The building out there in the world as the tour de force, and the building right here on our desks as the tour de main.
This method is a very, very simple one, and once you know how to do it, you can go right out and make an omelet immediately. What you do, you get your butter very hot, and you let it get into the pan, and then you shake your pan with this hand, and with the flat of your fork, you stir it. And as it begins to coagulate, you begin tipping your pan until it all gets down into the edge of the plate, and then you turn your pan and get your plate, and you just rest it on the lip of the pan, and over it goes like that.
The absence of eggs brings our attention to the technique of the hand, the tools, the craft of bringing the recipe to life. It makes visible that which is normally hidden from view. An omelet is a delicious fact, but cooking one requires its sublimation, the redaction of the eggs, and training the forearm. In studio, as we practice to become architects, do we also sublimate buildings, as John McMurrow warns us that we do? Bruno Latour, well, it's not been a year since his death. I wanted to kind of bring him back. Has beautifully illustrated this conundrum of the construction of facts, the sublimation of process, demanding to make visible the mechanisms that fabricate truths, adding the social scientific dimension, and therefore critique to science. Latour, of course, is a pun here. Latour, the tower. So, hence he appears at the conclusion of my introduction on building a tower. The building as fact sublimates the process of building. Building as gerund sublimates the objecthood of building. We're always engaged in both, but somewhere on the spectrum lie a series of disciplinary arguments for and against one or the other position. So let us begin. I know that the presentations that follow will move us through these different positions in provocative ways. And I did kind of steer some of our presenters toward the recipe or toward the kind of craft of the trade. But I did leave the title blank to be filled in by each of the party differently. First act, Mira Henry and Matthew Au recently published a beautiful compendium gathering terms, materials, sensibilities around their practice. Second act, Andrew Zago, someone who has taught me how to teach. I always call him a teacher's teacher here at the school, and a huge influence on many of us at the table. Third act, Florencia Pita, a force to be reckoned with, both force, tour de force and tour de man, I think. Always cooking up new recipes, not unlike Julia Child. And Dwayne Oyler, who together with Jenny Wu is growing one of the most important building practices here in LA and around the world. Thank you all for participating. Please help me in welcoming Mira and Matthew.
So, we didn't, Mira and I are talking together, and so it could kind of go in different ways. We didn't write things out, so we're gonna just stop talking at 20 minutes. Our presentation is building a building. A couple of things, Mira and I work together as partners, we work as collaborators, and really kind of started Current Interest as a focus around this idea of building a building. And so we thought for the symposium today to talk about a building that we're currently building. This is something that is a project that started about 3 years ago. We're gonna try to maybe start with the omelet, with the finished omelet, and then we'll go backwards and kind of talk about the parts and think about the ways in which that omelet gets assembled. And so, again, as I was mentioning, this is a building we started around right in the middle of the pandemic, and it was something that has taken quite some time. It's not a very large building. It's only about 300 square feet, but its parts and its assembly were something that has stretched out through, let's say, multiple craftspeople, builders, construction elements, and also during that time through a set and series of different formats, so renderings, models, and actually a sort of building. And so here we kind of see the building as it stands, at least
6 months ago.
6 months ago, yeah, before it's completed. And the building itself is something that we're calling Terracotta House. Kind of the name given over to its facade, which is a series of these stacking terracotta tiles that align the sort of perimeter of the house.
So Terracotta House was, I think that to say that we are presenting building a building is also a way of saying that it's also how we've been building our practice, right? So we began working together 5 years ago, and with the intention really not to become best friends, although we have become very, very close friends, but to build together. And so in some ways, profiling just one building of the many that we've been working on is also a way of kind of telling the story of also how we've begun to build a practice together. And Terracotta House was a project that kind of become it touches on these various kind of critical things for us having to do with material history, craft, tectonics, aesthetics, color, all kinds of things, also having to do with how we make images, how we give over work to people that is not us, like not building it ourselves, but then also how we also learn how to kind of craft certain things as something kind of critical in the way that we are able to understand what we're making and how to even imagine scaling it. So both how to specify it out, but also try to understand in kind of in close detail how something would be crafted in order for us to be able to imagine in another way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of it is maybe to the Julia Childs an act of both learning how to give instruction, and then also learning how to from various other professionals and entities how to write instructions and how to take instruction. So we'll go backwards to the very beginning of this, and not necessarily as a sort of don't take any of these images as a sort of genius sketch of anything, but it's just a sort of moment. The complete opposite, yeah. And so the project actually began, as Mira was saying, we consider ourselves a material practice, one that engages with the material world, and the consequences of that, and its politics, its various other relations. But this project really began online while we were both remote and trying to figure out how to actually design a building over Zoom. And so a lot of the things that we started doing is just regularly screenshotting our communications with one another. And so the sketches themselves are not necessarily intended as a sort of building, but as maybe evidence of arguments, evidence of moments where we're trying to describe to Corey Mkaju, who was working for us at the time, like how to design and draw certain details, how to model certain details. And
also trying to figure out what our vocabulary is, I think, too. Yeah, like it's like this one. Oh yeah, what is that one? So the terracotta, one of the first pictures that you saw of the building, it's an attached ADU connected to an existing house built in the 1930s. And many of the houses in LA, many of the houses of that era all have terracotta roofs. And generally they're lap systems, and over time those tiles break and they put more tiles on top of it. And in this house, like many on the block now have like 4 layers of terracotta tiles stacked on top of one another, in order to keep it from leaking. And it still leaks a little bit, even still, the terracotta actual roof house. But of course, the kind of world of terracotta cladding and roofs has broad history. And so in some ways we are, and both of us have history in making things and in clay also. So we wanted to start this kind of first small building that we knew we were going to be able to execute and work on something that we'd always wanted to work on. This is an image we were finding when we were thinking, okay, what is terracotta in architectural at architectural scale? This is the company in Germany that does like At.Act would be using to do kind of these kind of high end, quite incredible ways of thinking about how to clad a building three-dimensionally with these kind of exotic either extrusions or cast systems.
We thought this image was interesting. I mean, it shows the sort of wide range of clay-based or terracotta like technologies that have advanced over time that go into building really amazing buildings. And
look how small the people look.
Yeah, these things are incredible. Well, at the same time, for us, it seemed like actually not the direction we were interested in, and instead we were interested in actually the crude terracotta block, the piece that is usually the filler in walls, that gets stuffed and hidden, that has a sort of engineered object that allows for its lightness, the image on the top, a built-in handle so people can carry it. And so we're kind of trying to figure out what we can do with that, and really kind of work in a way that was cheap and fast, and or not necessarily fast. I mean, the whole project was pretty slow, but
Efficient.
efficient.
It's a sort of
Yeah.
efficiency. So we pick up the phone, which is usually how we start a project. In some ways, that we draw and then we pick up the phone, and so we start calling around and in Ohio. Ohio is a great place where they make a lot of brick. You know, either you go to Mexico or you go to Ohio. Ohio has where you get all of the brick, and for a lot of kind of historically speaking in the United States. So I start calling companies in Ohio. Talk to this woman, Ann Yang. She's amazing. She wants to talk about clay. We start talking about clay. We talk about clay for like months. And she's extremely generous, multi-generational terracotta, architectural terracotta company. And we start talking about, you know, how to do something for us here in LA. Yeah.
And you know, when you can't afford form, right? So when you can't afford the sort of custom cast blocks, you tend to turn towards differences that are produced through material. So looking at different sort of colors of clay that you can work with, or the textures that are the byproduct of the machinery that actually gets that extrudes the units, and starting to think about what you can do with that.
Yeah, and so also say the way that the material behaves, this front, its back, but also how it gets fabricated, right? So this is an example of what it looks like for a component to be extruded, and wire cut. This is a picture from the sand coal clay in Ohio. Oh, it's working.
It might not work.
Oh, okay.
Let's see.
This is the video that was sent to us of
Yeah, it won't work.
our pieces. Too bad, being extruded.
Is the sound going to turn on? Maybe not. Okay.
No.
Well, we can enact it. So the process of extruding these tiles was kind of working with a pretty standard die for extruding brick, and then a person would take that brick and to make our, let's say, custom version of it, would take a single brick and then before it was baked, hand cut it. So we had a video showing the process of that, which is unfortunate that it's not showing, but we also drew that in the studio for the book. So Nihan had produced a set of drawings for us that was showing the way in which a sort of industrial process was then carried by hand and cut with this wire cutter. And the feedback between us and the tile company, the sort of drawings that we would send them and the drawings that they would send back to us about the sort of micro differences. We're talking about like 1/6 of a difference in terms of the clay thicknesses and things that we would spec versus what they would return.
And then we were working with how to treat and coat the terracotta. We were working with a particular kind of mineral paint that works like an engobe, something that actually, for people who understand ceramics, it's a way of coating kind of like a paint, but that goes on to terracotta or another kind of clay body, and over time will actually kind of chemically bind with it. So not a glaze, we couldn't afford glazing these tiles, but we could do an engobe. And so we worked with a company that would produce one that was the exact color that we were interested in. And that took a lot of testing, you know, because this is not really something that every kind of clay is different. You know, they'll say like, well, when you spit on it, how long does it take for the spit to absorb, things like that. You need to know all kinds of things we learn before or else the kind of fit of one thing to another. So I mean, this is sort of where a lot of the joy comes from in the things that we do. It's kind of like how you make the sausage, but this is where this is a big part of kind of what we think about and where our conversations lie.
Yeah, and early on when we were talking to Anna about the sort of symposium, she said to kind of show things that are on your phone that you normally wouldn't show other people, and probably about 60-70% of the images on my phone are things like this image on the right, where I'm just like photographing a spec or a receipt or photographing a sort of call number to something else. And so a lot of the work that we would do is to kind of try to track down sort of paint versions versus, that were based off of, let's say, the images that we were producing or the images that we were trying to replicate. And so going through catalogs of like, Benjamin Moore, things that you can actually communicate with the paint companies where they could actually match what you're working with.
These are some pictures of the tiles when they're in fabrication, drying out over a period of time before they could get fired and then sent to us. These are pictures in Ohio. And then when they got to us in our office here in LA, this is Omid, who's here, who helped us clean each tile hand by hand, prepare them with kind of a sealant in order to be able to absorb the engobe. My precious husband and him painting these by hand. I mean, this is hardcore low tech. I mean, very, very much so. But of course, if you don't do it right, it looks bad. So it's actually quite high tech.
Yeah. And I mean, this is kind of a nice image of our studio where you see the spillage of all of our various projects. You see a little bit of Mira's rough code in the top left corner, piled in a corner next to these tiles that are getting painted.
Yeah.
So in the process of this, we're also, while building the building at full scale, also working on reversioning it or kind of producing other forms of representation of it in both model and drawing form. And so this is a relatively large model in which we're trying to take the real material that we were working with at the time and try to find a scalar equivalent of it. And so we got down to a sort of scale of like 1.5 inches equals a foot, because that's probably the smallest aggregate that we could get to kind of match that scale. And so you build the scale of the model based off of the sort of material that you can actually use, as well as kind of designing books that would kind of start to replicate the aggregate mixtures. And then, sorry, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit around the sort of aggregate. But do you want to?
Well, I think that the model is so beautiful. Just to go back one more time. This model, we sent this model to Copenhagen for biennial. It came back in pieces, unfortunately. But this starts to talk about the interior. A lot of the project was developed as an idea about an exterior, but the interior was also quite important. And part of that was this idea and this kind of study of concrete and concrete aggregate and the tints of that and the way in which we can understand the mix and the way that it would get ground, much like a terrazzo, but a kind of a more brutal version of a terrazzo.
Yeah,
So this was something that we'd been studying at first as pavers and thinking about how concrete aggregate could be kind of custom mixed and studied and through craft. And this is an example of the pavers, its formwork, its layup. And I think that you'll be able to see Angel, who is an amazing concrete person, casting the pavers. Mm-hmm. And then us and trying to replicate Angel, which is really, really difficult, but nonetheless trying to figure out how we have kind of invested in trying to figure out how to do this concrete for ourselves a bit, but also because we're working on it at a larger scale for another building as a kind of a large scale cladding system. And so we really needed to be able to talk to the fiber concrete guy, because we needed him to do what we wanted to do. In order for us to do that, we kind of need to know how to do it ourselves. So we've been studying that.
And
15 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay, thank you. And the texture was actually quite difficult. It is something that is a skill that is done by hand in terms of how you distribute aggregate, and every concrete person who kind of distributes stone distributes it in a very different way, and so it acts as a sort of signature. And so we were trying to replicate this other person's signature, which is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, we're like, oh, where's Angel? Oh my goodness.
And so trying different ways, both in 1-to-1 scale, and then working with Jishun over the winter break, trying to figure out how to do it at a model scale, right? And so here, individually placing aggregates, Jishun kind of brilliantly pre-composing the aggregate mixture before it would actually go in. Yeah. All right.
It's really beautiful. Drawing it carefully, right?
And thinking about how that material kind of gets distributed, it can turn up a surface, become cladding, or become is something that occupies a sort of ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is just an example, a quick diversion into another project, but we're not going to really go quite there.
Yeah, but just the range of samples and like trying to kind of perfect that distribution. You're seeing.
And then the kind of idea of tint and tone and kind of texture is kind of moves through various materials, also wood. And so we've been studying wood and how to think about how to bring tone into various wood systems. So we can kind of flip through this.
Yeah,
We'll never
the
get
range
there.
of concrete colors, aggregates,
So beautiful.
wood dyes, us testing wood dyes.
Yeah. Drawing it. And then we'll just kind of end with a couple of pictures of a series of photos of like the construction process of the kind of beginning with the foundation and the curb, and the framing goes up, and us beginning to think about trying to figure out how to clad it.
That's it.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Hi, everyone. And with my partner, Laura Bouwman, I'm a principal of Bouwman Zago. We have a small practice. I won't make a lot of claims for it, but there's one point that I do make a claim for. We are 100% MBS free, and I hope look for the logo and ask for it by name. I have, as with my colleagues, a really great love for the materials and the methods of creative production. And as my colleagues know, I absolutely love to talk about my own work and to show it at great length. But I'm going to not do that today, actually. And I thought it was maybe a little more relevant for the moment to unpack a couple of the implications of the symposium brief that maybe some of you have read. And so my title is a reworking of the first sentence of Anna's brief, building as a spatial endpoint, one that can be difficult to engage intellectually. And so I thought that would be a great way of describing the strength and the interest in building itself. I'm going to make it clear here, I'm working on some new material here, okay? So this is fresh. It's not going to be so smooth, but I'll try to just get through my points. I think it'll be actually relatively brief. In fact, I think Anna's presentation, some of the things that I'm going to talk about, Anna already unpacked in ways that are probably more subtle and more entertaining than what I have to talk about. But let's go to this. Building as a spatial endpoint. So I noted in this statement that the building as an artifact is deflected away in the very first sentence of the brief, going into the gerund that Anna described. And I thought that given just the current milieu at SCI-Arc, that could be misconstrued as a demotion of the status of building for other things. And I'm not saying that Anna meant that, but I thought in this context it was important. So I wanted to argue instead for the centrality of building to speculative practice today, but also argue for the necessity of what I would call extra building work. And that these extra building activities fall generally into two categories. One, things to directly make a building project, that is, things to realize a work, and I think we just saw some of it now. And two, things that are intended to achieve a degree of autonomy In other words, to further maybe creative speculation, even if their exact relationship to a building project isn't clear, and that there's an overlap. Sometimes things do both of these things. So architecture is building and not. And the reason I say this, it's sometimes I think said explicitly in some experimental corners of architecture. Other times it's certainly implied that architecture as a building problem is over in terms of speculation. I wanted to point out first off that that kind of statement or that kind of implication has been around for I think at least 50 years. So it's not a new point. But I wanted to make two different counterpoints to that. The first one is that it capitulates the uniquely engaged and even political dimension of the built environment to others. It simply lets go of that from speculation and gives it to others. And for that, I'll show a quote here from a lecture that Jeff Kipnis gave a number of years ago at Harvard talking about the political dimension of architecture. He says democracy is an idea, but that freedom is a feeling, and that in fact, architecture, which as Anna describes is difficult to engage intellectually, is not very good at ideas, but it's well within our capacity to create the feeling and to embrace that as the politics of it. The second thing I wanted to say is that this idea of building being no longer relevant to speculative architecture is that there is a preponderance of evidence that a lot of building continues and will continue to go on with or without us. I didn't know how to find a statistic for it, so it turns out, just as a small slice of what that might be, the US Census Bureau every year puts together new privately owned housing units authorized by building permits in permit issuing places. So in 2022, they're in thousands, almost 1.7 million new housing units, new public housing units. So if we extrapolate from that number and think generally how many new building projects are permitted in the United States, and then add to that the global range, we are talking many tens or hundreds of millions of buildings that are being built every year. So the idea of it no longer being relevant maybe touches on to the question, which is important, that the percentage of these projects in which a creative practice can engage, let alone make a viable business out of, is seriously reduced. And I think that's an important thing to talk about, maybe not in the context of this symposium, but to suggest that building is going anywhere and that people aren't going to do it is patently absurd. And so to not imagine that we have something to contribute to that is simply to cede, again, this important territory. Okay, so this is the beginning of a series of slides that go off on another path that I think I've presented in several, I'm sure a lot of my colleagues have seen, and Anna and I have done elaborations on it, trying to make a distinction between what we would refer to as a discipline of architecture versus the profession of architecture. I'm not going to show that. I've kind of retooled them a bit with some different terminology for today's discussion. So we have this. There's this larger thing that we call the profession of architecture, all works done by, let's say, licensed professional architects around the world. And then this very, very small circle, which we're going to call work that's disciplinary. A few points. First off, I thought for today maybe we're talking about the processes and products. So rather than talking about fields, I changed it so we're talking about things. So let's talk about building projects versus disciplinary works. Maybe the most important thing to point out, a couple of things. First off, not to scale. God knows how many countless buildings are being built. If only we could summarize those. Unfortunately, the little dotted circle of projects that we could take as in one way or another, seriously undertaking architectural as a cultural project is regrettably small. A couple of things. First off, there's a dashed line. So I am not trying to make an argument for a defined canon of what would be considered high architecture versus not. It's porous, it's subject to change, it's subject to argumentation. There's many, many different interpretations of it. This is something that Anna and I had a chance to elaborate on a number of years ago. But what I want to argue is that it's also not arbitrary and nothing. There is some kind of center of gravity that we can talk about as being this. Now, Almost everything is in this outer circle that is outside the dashed line and inside the big circle. This is both buildings as well as all that trivial ephemera that goes into the making of buildings. I want to talk about that later because there's, I think, a bizarre obsession with some of that trivial ephemera in some circles of architecture today. And then there's this, and this would be, it's a contested cloud of disciplinary buildings. Which buildings do we consider important, current or past, in terms of, let's say, kicking the ball further down the field of architecture as a cultural and speculative project? And then the last one is complete works that are not buildings. That is, things that we can think of as works in and of themselves, but are not buildings. I can think of a couple of examples of that. A classic one that I always like to pull up from 1979 is Daniel Liebeson's set of micromegas. They are not buildings, and yet it changed the way a lot of people thought about buildings. And I think some would argue that some texts exist in that way as well, that clearly are not buildings, but yet become so fundamental to our conception and spawn so many. There was a period where lots of the graduate program here at SCI-Arc was beholden to this particular text of Bob Somel. So there are sometimes other things like that. But there's also other things that, well, let's see, the degrees of autonomy. There's other things that you produce in the context of making a building as a speculative practice that have varying degrees of relationship to the building project. In other words, they're not thought of as completely autonomous, like the micromegas or like a particular architectural text, but have a degree of autonomy. And these go into, I think, three different categories, kind of. Things that you look at, things that you think about, and things that you use to make other things. So we'll go to the first two, things to think about and things to make other things. And I think this touches more on Anna's points. The first one, things to think about, is, let's say, in the realm of ideas. A book of philosophy, for example, is not meant to study the typography and weigh it and smell the pages, but you're supposed to be transported past that to think about the context of that thing. That is, that part about building as a spatial endpoint is difficult to engage intellectually. It's very hard to have that kind of deep read of a building in spite of its physical appearance that one can have, say, with a book of philosophy. So it's a different capacity. It is a component of architecture, which we'll talk about in a minute, but I will always consider that as an accessory to architecture. Its theoretical or intellectual capacity rather than central to its capacity. The second one often falls into the category of instructions and other kinds of necessary documents. So this, sorry, Anna went high, I went low. So, you know, we don't look, you don't smell the recipe to imagine just how delicious it is. And in exactly the same form, you could perhaps put together some of the most subtle and beautiful culinary achievements. In this case, actually, it's to make these, which some of you might like. I don't know. It has a certain fascination, I admit. So these are not intrinsically something that have a value, but are relative to this. Now, and this is some of these I was referring to as trivial ephemera that we produce in building. You know, we produce, even a modest building could have several thousand pages of specifications. And as a lot of you know who've taken professional practice classes, once there's a problem and the lawyers get involved, this takes precedent, in fact, over the drawings. But these are not special esoteric documents to ponder for some buildings. This is the warp and weft of every single building that of any size that we build. I do want to say that there are very interesting modifications of this. There are those things that we obsess over in that making of something that ought, the layout of the Julia Child cookbook, let's say, is quite different than the quick Jell-O recipes. The Blackwing No. 2 pencil. This is apparently people as different as the composer Quincy Jones and the cartoonist Chuck Jones, not to mention Nabokov, could not have conceived of working unless they had their trusty Blackwing #2 pencil. And so we understand this, or that Herman Melville claiming, according to Charles Olson, that he never understood Shakespeare until he had this very special edition of it, and both its typography and especially its wide margin where he could start putting in all of his notes allowed him to gain access to it. I'm pretty sure Herman Melville worked before the invention of the Blackwing #2 pencil, but nonetheless, I'm sure he had his own. He had his thing that he obsessed over. Or for those of you that know, I don't, but mathematicians, apparently, there's many brilliant mathematicians and physicists who says they cannot work without this particular Japanese full-touch chalk. The company went out of business. People bought out the entire warehouses of it, and now these boxes go for a lot of money on eBay because there are people like this physics PhD at Columbia, apparently, working out topological problems of knots, who couldn't do it with anything other than that particular form of chalk. And we all, we could talk at great length about this. So I want to say that we understand that there's a complication to, let's say, that conceptual portion of it. But the thing I want to talk about mostly is this, things to look at, and this will be a kind of conclusion. So what I want to say with that one is that banal ephemera is mostly just that, but on occasion one has to pay special attention to it, as with the use of the pencils or special typography. But then there are things that have in and of themselves an intrinsic quality. And I'm going to argue that this is a kind of pre-intellectual mental capacity, that it's sensate rather than theoretical, and in my view, more fundamental to material practices, architecture included. And so this comes into this. I'll do this very briefly. There are things which one looks at, and one understands them as an experience. A particular painting, a particular dish, once it's prepared and one eats it. So there's a kind of presence, there's an immanence to it. And then there are other things that are projective. That shopping list I make in order to make that meal, you're not supposed to treasure this, as something, it doesn't have an intrinsic value into it. What I find really interesting about architecture that's unique as a material practice is occasionally, and I think we've all been there, sometimes we build the buildings ourselves, or at least large parts of the facade. For the most part, we don't. We make things that others make. But then the creative working area is that we have this special capacity of working through things that even while they're instructions for a future construction, have in varying degrees a presence. So there is a kind of immanence involved, even as they're there to imply something else. So it could be something like a working drawing for the new National Gallery by Mies van der Rohe, sublime in its visual effect, and yet there to make sure that the steel is made quite right and measurements are accurate. Other things that are more ambiguous in terms of how they go back and forth. I didn't know Tom was going to be here. There's a number of things. We had a symposium here talking about some of the models, and I think some of the same things could be said about them. I'm showing here Frank's obsessions with various kinds of animals, and then we know that these play out. Sometimes they spin off, and you could sell them at the Gagosian Gallery for a lot of money, but other times they also simultaneously become a working space for projects, sometimes a little more literally, where not only are these models, but one understands that you work through it by understanding that the creative working space is the experience of the thing itself, even while you're trying to describe this thing and work out this thing that you will later build. And then the last one, and this is where I'll end, and then have a couple points at the end. Where you start working, this is maybe where I would put maybe the Libeskind drawings that I showed earlier. Things that aren't made initially, they're thought of as architectural. The blue never quite disappears. Otherwise, I would argue it goes into the realm of art. Nothing wrong with that, just not our field. Where the building portion of it is speculative or unknown or not yet defined, and other things take precedent. And so, perspective is worked out not as a way of organizing cities, but as a kind of speculation about geometric construction and rationalization of space. But you can play that out, and eventually it does become first in in painting and then later in reality, a certain way of organizing our cities. And just end with something, just because I happen to be coming across some of this work recently in another context. The architect Marshall Brown, some of you may know him, he teaches at Princeton. He's been working through explicitly talking about collage as a new form of architectural representation. And I found this curious for a couple of reasons. It's not where I would thought one would look at all, and I could argue intellectually against it as a product of the early 20th century. And we know some occasions of it. But that capacity of collage, more seen in early 20th century art, where logical connections are undermined by other kinds of spatial disjunctions, and it hovers between the two, struck me as interesting. And he has theorizing this, and part of his pedagogy is around what a mountain to climb to say you're going to add to plan section, elevation, perspective, and model making as a new form of architectural representation. So, good luck with that. But I do see that there's at least an attempt in Follies to see what that building implication of it. So, vague points for speculative practice. In conclusion, embrace the politics of buildings, make buildings and not, make things that are present and projective, make things that are autonomous from buildings, but not too autonomous, make architecture conceptual, but not too conceptual, take interest in the banal ephemera of the building process, but don't fetishize them. Thank you. You got it? We need more?
This time I'm not going to take the circle diagram and elaborate on that. I'll do it the next time. If I knew, I would, but too late. So thank you, Anna, Shaki, and Elena for the invitation today. So I took on the blank and then added building a curve. So this presentation is a story about drawings, about lines, but more specifically, it's a quest on how to build a curve. In Anna's introduction for building a blank, she brings our attention to three elements: material, design, and labor. I would like to begin by talking about labor, about how things get done. How do we make stuff? What is a building? How do we build curves? The following sequence of images are recent projects that we're working on at the office. And I would like to mention Rachel McCall, who's here and teaching thesis this summer. She has been an important collaborator in all the most recent projects. So thank you, Rachel. And also we teach together at SCI-Arc. Where do we build curves? If we build in a factory, we say we fabricate them. The realm of the factory is the landscape of machines. Machines and machine operators. But it's also the space for craft and expertise and teamwork. The factory is a setting for craftsmanship that treats the work with care and very softly. In the factory, the design work becomes tangible. It becomes real. Yet, it retains the residue of the machine. And at the same time, it acquires a patina of uniqueness. On the other hand, if we build on site, we say we construct. On site, the tools are mobile. The materials can be fluid, but it certainly travel long distances. Land and form blend on site. But no matter if the context is the factory or the site, the craft of labor is the act of building. The question is, what is the value of the act of building? Is it the act of building a craft? In the 19th century, John Ruskin asked that question, and his answer was found literally in the nature of Gothic, in what is natural in Gothic architecture. His context was that of a country, England, that had swiftly transformed from an agricultural society to an industrial one. This fast industrialization process also changed the role of labor. The old model of craftsmanship and expertise was now traded to mass production and automation. But something else changed, our environment, which has been forever transformed. For Ruskin and the pre-Raphaelites, the answer to the perils of industrialization was to look at nature with more attention, to make the human-nature duality into a flat continuum. William Morris, who was a student of Ruskin, also acknowledged this cultural shift, and his answer was also to observe nature in close reading. But he also understood that the world of industry, the world of machines, had to be tangled with nature. Morris, trained as an architect, became a factory owner, Morris & Co., and later a social reformer. He promoted the need to combine craftsmanship and mass production in order to retain the texture and uniqueness that derives from craftsmanship. As he also recognized the democratic availability of the products of mass production. Now, in order to build a curve, we need to draw a curve. As architects, we design with drawings. Ruskin also had something to say about drawing, of course. In his book from 1854, he breaks down the elements of drawings. Here, he's teaching us directly through letters. He asks that we look closely at nature, beginning by drawing the flatness of a leaf, its contour and form, asking us to choose the materiality of paper, the tint, the tone, so we can learn to observe our environment. Now, maybe we're ready to build the curve. If we change the orders of words, sorry, Anna, it will compel us to design thinking with material and labor. I would like to begin with a project from early in my career, a project for an installation. I believe that gallery installations forces us to quickly combine design, material, and labor, and budget. This project takes on the teachings of Ruskin, yet here nature is a photograph and pencil is a digital trace. Material is plastic and color is artificial. We might ask what installations are. Are they architecture? Are they furniture? Are they art? This project relied heavily on machining processes and the currency of robotic manufacturing in the 21st century. If fabrication was set within the context of the factory, then it had to strive for the softness of plasticity and its tight grip on form. Yet this installation was still unsure in its role as pure ornament. Ornament superfluous yet alluring pedigree? But no matter how scientific the process of fabrication is, the machines needs the aid of the hand, so that details can begin to emerge, to ensure the blending of automation and manufacturing. So the soft forms of plasticity can become naturally crisp. Continuing with the elements of drawing, what if the literal appearance of curves of flowers can be flattened and abstracted to families of curves? Curves projected and outlined, lines and curves that are drawn with pencil, maybe that pencil, and painted by hand, but also machines with true non-material material, with a finish of soft spray paint, yet also carefully painted with a paintbrush by hand and left to dry, in order to become architecture, furniture, or art in the space of the museum. What happens when installation ideas exit the museum to be in the city? Does design graduate from installation to architecture? But what if it made it to architecture, but it's only facade? This facade is flattened into a texture that is traced out of letters that make up a logo belonging to a brand. The same curves continue in the interior, enveloping the fixtures and the undulating walls. But maybe it did not make it to architecture, and it's only furniture with texture and curves. Wait, what if it can be architecture if the curves are poured in concrete and the light casts a shadow of curvature onto walls, and material is rough and tectonic? Are we in architecture now? Okay, back to the city. The city of LA. So here we're building, which, as we discussed, means to fabricate or construct in the factory and the site a building which is an architectural object on top of an existing building which is built work. So building a building on top of a building. This building is almost as big as its host building. It's voluptuous and outlined. This building has a facade that looks west on sunset at the setting sun. This building is architecture. But for now, and not for too long, this building is only built out of plastic. To conclude, we look back at nature and curvature as a flattened drawing of land, line, and curve in order to build landscapes of architecture and not landscape architecture. So we can begin building a curve again. Thank you.
There are only a handful of things that I can say that I've loved for as long as I can remember. I've always loved to draw, and I've always loved to build things. And as much as we tend to associate those things with one another, in many ways you could say that they represent fundamentally different things. One opens up blue sky thinking, and it encourages us to imagine an unknown world, one that either doesn't exist yet or that can't exist in today's world. It isn't tethered by reality, and its representational ambiguities lend themselves to interpretations that extend far beyond the concrete realities that so often smother ideas. But the built world is a world of excruciating constraints. From material limitations to budget constraints, from gravity to programmatic preconceptions, reality is often unyielding. It's unforgiving, and at times it moves agonizingly slowly. And the cultures that we so desperately hope to affect at times seem to resist every move outside of what they've come to know. Well, architecture occupies this incredibly unique position. It's one that's tasked with negotiating those two worlds. And that's precisely what makes it so powerful. So, what distinguishes architecture from, say, conventional forms of art? Painting, drawing, sculpture. Sculpture is, after all, built. Well, one major part of what makes it different is its role in negotiating our necessities and our desires, our essentials and our expressions. When we speak of architecture's ability to reflect cultural ideas or come to move cultural behaviors, we have to first ask ourselves, why on earth would we be able to do that as architects in ways that are different or could potentially be more potent than the world of art? From my point of view, it's because architecture requires us to elevate the known world, and by that I mean mostly buildings. Not entirely, but mostly buildings, to become something other. Well, I'm not interested in buildings, per se. I'm interested in that something other that only they can bring. Something that, while not pure art, has found interesting and artful ways of elevating what we thought we already knew. It offers us a different way of living, a way of putting technologies to use, and a different way of connecting to people. But it doesn't do that if it isn't built. Architecture rubs up against our daily lives. It's up close and personal. It's constantly up in our business. It compels interaction. We often can't escape it. It tells us where to look. It tells us where we can't look. It tells us where we can enter, where we can't enter. It plays a role in dividing us, and it plays a role in bringing us together, often in beautiful ways. Unlike some forms of art, it isn't great at commentary, humor, or irony, because it requires an endurance that so often necessitates more nuanced levels of abstraction. It isn't a spectacle that's meant to be put up on a pedestal. It's something that we have to live with. Something that becomes a kind of extension of who we are. It's this wonderful dance between daily existence and a poetic sense of what it means to be alive. It's this entanglement with our day-to-day life that offers us tools that I personally find far more compelling than sculpture. But again, it doesn't do that if it isn't built. This isn't to say that there isn't an important role to play for those who don't or haven't yet built. I respect that, and in most cases, I find profound beauty in the purity of the work. The influence that the unbuilt world brings is immense. I believe that. The path to building meaningful work, it's a long, hard slog, and most just haven't gotten there, myself included. But all of us, again, myself included, should take a long, hard look at the steps necessary for real architectural engagement in the world around us. The truth is, I've spent exponentially more time on things that have little chance of being built than those that have been built. But I'd rather have a direct impact on the built environment than just influence those who do. So I'll keep chipping away at it, and I would encourage all of you to do the same. As a person who so often advocates for architecture with a capital A, I should admit I'm somewhat reluctant to play this role today. It presumes that somehow only I know what architecture is and isn't, or that its limits might be so clearly defined as to exclude a more broad definition. I certainly wouldn't argue for placing constraints on the inputs that come to bear on the work that we do, any of us. My own love of making is broad. This is where the slides are important. Tables to towers, tree houses to tricycles, puzzles to pavilions, cars to chairs, models of all shapes and sizes, weird objects, you name it. I'm kind of all over the place. And I've certainly done my share of drawing. But I do want everyone to consider what architecture's most effective role is. I personally find no greater reward in life than the idea that something we've designed is built and out there affecting the world. From my point of view, architecture is only powerful when it draws on that incredibly broad range of influences: cultural, aesthetic, technological, artistic. To not allow these deep interests to permeate your work would not only be a missed opportunity, it would be boring as hell. But again, my point of view is that it is critical that we understand where our potency lies, and that is in the negotiation between tethered reality and worlds unknown. And there is no better way to test those ideas than through the lens of the built world. If you count both teaching and my time as a student, architecture school has been a part of my life for 32 years now. By many measures, I'm an academic, still working toward becoming the practicing architect that I want to be. One of the incredible balancing acts as an architect that an architect has to play is in charting a course for one's practice through the day-to-day work that's required to get there. And that includes the work that you do as a student. Academia has been one of the great joys of my life. It's been where ideas have been born, debated, sometimes fail, and I say that with great respect for the risk takers. And because of that concentration of brilliant and wonderfully seductive ideas from both faculty and students alike, it offers a great number of paths to go down. But I'm not sure we encourage this idea of building enough. I'm not sure we encourage this idea of building enough. So as your thesis progresses, I'd ask that you think about what makes an architectural idea resonate in the world. And in my opinion, there's no better way to do that than to imagine it built. So go out and build. Build something that resonates with you, and much more importantly, build something that resonates with the world around you. Thank you.
Dwayne, would you like to click through your slides without the
Will it
text?
do
Or if you'd like.
No, I don't need to.
Nah, okay. Well, thank you all for your presentations. As I expected, nobody really followed any kind of script. We all kind of went off into a rogue territory, which is amazing, especially, Dwayne, when you say visual ideas and there's absolutely nothing visual about the presentation. It kind of brings it to the foreground. I think we have about kind of probably half hour remaining, and the idea of the roundtable is really to make it conversational, if possible. And of course, for the audience too, for the students to ask questions. I think in the end, we saw such different approaches. And even thinking about kind of the starting point of the tabletop versus the construction site, some of the terms that Florencia laid out for us, from fabrication to construction, from the factory to the actual site. There's scales at which we work. There are kind of recipes that we build. There are disciplinary kind of practices that Andrew has also spoken about that we have acknowledged at the table. And it seems to me that there are more differences and nuances that we have put on the table than perhaps similarities. And I'm curious if we can become a bit more nuanced about the term building, or what are we building? How can we put it all on the table and say it's all the same thing? It seems like the scales of things shift, and actually what we do really changes flavor, changes tone, in fact, and other things. There isn't really a question here, perhaps just yet, but more as a kind of prompt. How do we move forward from here? Because it seems that there's a kind of field of work. And I was thinking about who we are as kind of people or characters at the table. You spoke about instruction to Mira and Matthew, and instruction writing, also being instructors at the school as a kind of important modality. Dwayne, also you mentioned kind of pedagogy and being part of this institution for a very long time. Andrew, I would call you the disciplinarian. Always pointing us back to the kind of larger diagrammatic field, the conditions within which we operate, and the kind of writing, the intellectual project that we all participate in. Florencia, you're kind of showing these amazing photographs of fabrication, of always kind of working, collaborating, and always scaling up in terms of machines and materials. Dwayne, the negotiator, always comes to the table and kind of brings that visionary drawing model, but also into the world. And so maybe these kind of labels stick, maybe they don't, but I'm just curious if those are different ways of expanding a bit from a kind of singular category into a kind of more nuanced field.
Let the discipline.
Is that a question? It's funny, I just noticed I noticed less about the difference than the... I remember I gave a lecture years ago at the University of Michigan, and someone told me, it was Craig Scott, who was teaching her at the time, that the next week, Leon Creer spoke. But somehow he didn't have, somehow his laptop got lost or something, so he couldn't show anything. He just spoke. And he said, it's weird, without his slides, the stuff he said wasn't that different than what you said. And I thought, without your slides, a lot of architects can... I was I'll make one just general observation and I'll stop. All of the presentations, mine included, are kind of culturally atemporal, like an argument that could be made at different times about a lot of different work. And I think there is a temporal arc that is, let's say, the critical arc of speculation in the field that it needs to be acknowledged, thinking through the relevance or irrelevance of different undertakings. I mean, a little bit why I showed Marshall Brown is just because I thought there was actually something about the unity and disjunction of the spatial proposition of a collage, to bring it back into architecture now, would actually have a particular relevance. Not just are they nice or not nice. I just found that aspect of it interesting. I was thinking this was way back in 1979 when, Tom, I know you organized that series of lectures and talks here that we did a kind of revisit of a number of years ago. I remember Frank Gehry was showing his house. And I don't think, and it's recorded and you can watch it, I don't think he said anything about the cultural moment and the reinterpretation of discredited building practices or pop sensibilities finding, all of these things that made it such an important project, such a turning point in the history of architecture. None of that, he doesn't say any of that actually. I would say, so architects don't always have to say that. But I do think it's important to, one of SCI-Arc's great strengths, it's always valued creativity. its weakness is it's often equated with just personal expression, and any kind of creative expression was equal. And so none of our presentations tried to give a particular moment or political agency to the moment of the work that we're talking about. And maybe that's, I just wanted to point that out. So they all, otherwise, certainly the things I think could just be generic. I'm not sure I had a point there. Just.
One of the things I was really careful not to do, because it's bothered me for a bit, is this debate that it seems like it should have gone away long, long ago, but occasionally it still comes up, and I cringe every time I hear it, and that is, this is architecture and that's not. It's a horrible argument to try to draw that line. I think in many ways you could take what I said today, and you could walk out with a very simplified version of Dwayne said what he thinks architecture is. But I didn't draw a line because I think there are elements of what makes architecture powerful in virtually anything. Does that make it architecture? I don't know. But I do know where there is an incredible potency to architecture in its robustness. But I would just like to kind of kill this argument that there is an architecture and there is not an architecture. This is why I really wanted to say I love this and I love that, but there is a center in my mind to what we do where we are most potent.
I mean, I think that the kind of, I don't know exactly where in terms of where you land in terms of the question of the political, but I do think that there's something. When I read the brief, it's an extremely political brief in many ways. It's to say that quite the opposite of it defining architecture, but to actually say kind of orient us towards something that includes. That is completely inclusive in the sense that everything to a building, not only building as a noun, which is doesn't discriminate between whether or not it's is deemed architecture or not. It's a completely inclusive concept, and then the verb building and building is even more inclusive, and I think that to me is extremely timely. I think that is actually completely oriented in time, and I would say is built into the like looking to what does it mean to build, certainly as a craft and as kind of an aesthetic project, but also as a way of engaging in kind of dismantling of that hierarchy between what we can say is an architecture or is not an architecture. Because if we talk about building, then we're really in a territory among many, and that seems, I mean, at least to me, and certainly in our practice, but I'll speak for myself, feels like an important kind of a political stand, right? I mean, this is also maybe tied to looking out in the world and understanding, infrastructures and the ways in which kind of vernaculars exist in the world, and how, the ways in which kind of the non-aesthetic project in architecture is nonetheless a space of, should be a space of criticality, because it's what impacts, like I think what you said, I love the term you said about architecture, it's what we live with. Architecture is what we live with. You know what I mean? Like this is like, would be an absurd thing to say that there's no value in it. It's like it is our built environment, right? So I think that there's something very to this at this moment that is at stake certainly in the way that in the phrasing and in the use of the word itself. which I think is important.
But I mean, I like to respond to that. I mean, my presentation was a pun on the architecture police, not so much on making a separation. I do think that this is why I agree and disagree with Andrew's circles, you know? I mean, am I in a circle? How far? Center, left, right? And that this idea of the architecture police, this is dismissing, you know, much of the work sometimes. And this is why I show earlier work that so many times I've been introduced as an artist. So I made it as a pun of like almost giving personality to the project and then them trying to make it, finally, being accepted into the architectural building. So I like that Anna did not use the word architecture. She used the word building. Because the word building does not. So for me, it was interesting when looking through your description or your argument was to kind of look at labor, look at building construction, and really doesn't matter like whether it makes it or not, even though the character in the story makes it finally, no? Like it is always architecture, but running through the idea of craft, I thought that something that you see in everybody sitting at this table is the obsession with material, detail, texture, you know, it's like in that, and so in a way, building that might not be elevated to architecture, barn or who knows, factory or something, you know, like the elements that we start to kind of extrapolate from there are many. This is why for me, I find interesting isolating the discipline as an argument, but I think it isolates the discipline just too much to a certain moment when actually, once you look at it as a trade, once you look at it as building, it's very democratic. So I really like your position, Anna, because it made it very democratic, building and buildings. And we're not, you know, so at no point elevating it. It is architecture with capital A, or it didn't make it. Did it make it or didn't make it? So I saw it was really refreshing. I wanted to run through that story, and then, you know, I thought it was great, you know, Matthew and Mira, of, you know, also you get your hands dirty, you move up and down through that. And the idea that trade, I try to point it out through that notion of the factory, the field, handmade, the machine-made, which earlier on, you know, many of the discussions that we had here in this school in particular, almost the trademark of the machine had to be present as you make innovative architecture. So not only you were not an architect, but you are progressive architect if you use machines. So I really like this kind of flat ground that Anna set up for us. It's all buildings. It's all coming to the conversation. Then it's your filter of how you start to, maybe in the craft, in the details, in the materials, when you start to get in the forms, in the form processes, you start to find the narratives.
So my mind keeps returning back to the Julia Child images that you showed at the beginning. The three images, I guess. The omelet, and if I wasn't sitting right next to you, I thought you would have colluded with Anna about like the absent omelet kind of in the room, and the support chefs hiding underneath of Julia Child, kind of popping up the various completed recipe elements, and then the last one that was the image that keeps like sticking with me the most is this sort of Faraki like image of the camera pointed directly at the pan, and then everything else around it, the lights and all the other infrastructure. And I think that last image is the thing that I think in all of the conversations is the most relevant, in that nobody at the table did a formal analysis of a single building, right? Nobody talked about its geometry. Nobody talked about the sort of building as building, right? Instead, everybody talked about the things around the building, the structures, the frameworks, everything that kind of supports it, whether it's a sort of a disciplinary sort of framework, whether it's labor, whether it's a sort of like need to build, right, something, right? Everybody talked about everything that was around it. And I think that that is a sort of potent territory to move building forward, is that how do we start to think about the things that it becomes the sort of missing, it becomes that missing omelet, right? Where you don't need the omelet, but you can still like build a conversation around the omelet. And that I think is really important.
I realized that we have put on the table a bunch of opposites, like a lot of dichotomies, building versus architecture, building versus image. This came up with the conversation of AI versus building symposium, object versus process, something that is abstract versus material. And I think, in this kind of idealizing something versus building something, and all of the negotiation at stake. What I realized, Matthew, as you were kind of coming back to Julia Child, is that coming back to the kind of mise en scène, understanding labor processes, actually making those visible in the way in which we may present the work, allows for the ways in which we abstract to become ever more material. So some of these dualities that seem to be contradictory actually begin to complement one another. In other words, the more abstract the tile, the more material the phone call, the more personal the engagement. And in many ways, if we look to art practice as well, there are forms of abstraction that really go very deep into the construction of a piece. And this is the same for, let's say, building practice as it is for an image practice. We can make the same building arguments for the construction, and we have made in the previous symposium, the construction of an image might have the same kinds of media-related concerns that we might establish on a construction site or in our own kitchens, or in a kind of art gallery space. So I'm curious about how we can take some of these terms that seem to be contradictory and actually begin to merge them and kind of produce, again, a sort of nuance. I mean, I agree with what Mira, you were saying, that ostensibly it is meant to be a kind of political question, because to show an image of the building is very different than to show everyone who has labored on it to make it possible and to actually make that effort visible. So how to render a labor into the image of the building, perhaps was one of the questions that I wanted to ask today.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but you have me thinking about, I've done lectures where all I talk about really is the process of building something. This is like the last 5 slides are, and here's the really cool thing, right?
That's why you're here, Dwayne. I have seen those.
Yeah, I didn't.
They're magical.
You should have seen the slides; they were stunning. But if your intention is not really to build it, I don't know how you test it against the real world, and I don't mean the real world in a kind of pragmatic sense. I mean our goal here. We're using words like political or cultural, like we want to impact the world in some really meaningful way. And I think we have a tendency in school to sometimes think the thing we're putting on the wall is creating the image is creating an impact, but it hasn't been, it's been developed with an obsession for the processes that go into the image making. In the same way someone could obsess over craft or materiality without consciously thinking what that might mean in the real world. So I'm going to stop saying real world because I don't like that term either. What I want to say is if you're not consciously thinking about what it means to put it out in a cultural, political environment, then I don't know that you've got your eye on the ball, in terms of thinking about what we have as tools. what we do as architects, what kind of impact we could have as architects. We're largely talking to one another, hoping that someone else picks up that ball and goes and impacts the world.
I wonder if architects have different roles. I mean, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, Serlio, one of the most famous writers of architecture, did 3 buildings, you know?
Right.
He wrote what everybody did for centuries, you know? So I do think that you can't isolate building. This is why for me it's a craft. Something this small, you know, might bring up so many ideas that can affect culture at large. So I do think that it can't be the task. Some of the students might end up writing about architectures and affecting populations, you know, like Serlio. You know, some architects might become Palladio that did both. And so I do think that we have to be careful at what are we after? You know? So this is why I think that the way to go is to be democratic, the way that Anna is doing. You know? Maybe because she's, I think maybe I'm wrong at understanding you, but I think that this level playing allows you to come in from different points of view. The end might be that single building that might make a difference, or the end might be to do the next, 100 buildings, or be the next domain, or be Serlio. So I do think that we have to have in mind the building always. That's true. I agree with you 100%. We have to sit down. We have to teach the students, teach all of them about building something, building a drawing, building a model, and so building ideas. So I think the building is exactly where we have to go. And then we work through that. Sometimes you're good with clients and you have all these projects. Sometimes you go to a lot of parties, you have a lot of clients. It's so subtle, the difference about how you get a lot of work and how you don't get a lot of work. So I think that we have to make an open enough table for everybody to find a seat.
One thing about the sort of imprinting of this onto the building is that I think that and this is one thing that we've been kind of learning with the slowness and the value of slowness is how to be. We might even think of it as a sort of counter-conceptual model, where the idea doesn't necessarily precede the final outcome, but instead the slowness of it means that every time that Mira and I will lecture a project, we completely rewrite the lecture and we completely rewrite the way that we frame it and talk about it. And every time we write about something, it completely changes it. And so it accumulates a set of ideas and it accumulates that sort of process. And in a way, I think for at least me, that is the way that imprinting actually happens. Is that in the sort of slow take of the building getting constructed, it is the sort of constant revisiting of it and changing the sort of outlook that I think is important.
Oh, yeah.
I think I want to ask a question more towards Dwayne and Florencia. Like, buildings are mean sometimes. They're like sad, they hurt, they oppress, they perpetuate pain and perpetuate systems of sadness. And I think the flatness that you're describing might miss Andrew's seriousness about the problem, that there's a lot of buildings being built without us, and most of them, I think, aren't great. And I think it's, at least to me, I think it's important that we start thinking about that problem in particular, because otherwise, I think we just keep falling back into what you want to avoid, which is sort of staying in this disciplinary cycle. And I think I just have a question of whether, like, how do we be critical of architecture without saying it's not architecture? Because I think that's been really important to me when I walk around, because there's a lot of bad, sad building.
That's a tough one to answer directly, but I'll say a couple things. If I could do my version of your diagram.
I'll do it
That's
while
the
you
next
speak.
symposium.
Okay, there wouldn't be a circle. It would be a kind of, the most impactful would exist along this kind of gradient circle. So there's no in or out. There is a zone of greatest impact, which manages to accumulate all of these
We
different.
have a much more detailed version of that dashed line that we could do.
Yeah, I don't-
Different lecture.
Good luck
lecture.
making this diagram with your body.
The stochastic cloud of disciplinary dispute, I believe it was called.
Right, I don't think there's an in or out, for one.
No, it's a cloud.
It's not a cloud either, because because I thought, oh, well, the most impactful is in the center, but it actually isn't. It's most impactful where those two, where it's sort of, critical thinking has met that built world. It's somewhere along that line, for me, where it's most impactful. But to put an inside or an out is just, I don't know how you could operate or in particular teach today if you draw that line. So I don't want to put anyone inside or out. I want to identify where we're most impactful. It was yours was a dash line?
It's a dash line. I should have pointed out the most important thing I said is it's a dash line.
Okay.
There's a pretty heavy dash line now.
Everybody can argue. I just want to say that it's
dash
not just the arbitrary set of things that we would talk about. You get enough serious thinkers and practitioners about architecture, and you're not going to agree, but it's not just arbitrary points. There does start to be a center of gravity of what we're discussing. That changes over time. It changes with individual architects. But I'd like to argue that it is still possible to discuss a discipline without it turning into a kind of, top-down codified set of, limits and exclusions.
One more thing. I don't know if anyone has read these essays by Michael Benedict. There are a couple of them. There were supposed to be a bunch of them. These are very different kind of essays than I've read in a long time. They're both from the last couple of years. But they talk about the role of economies and the sort of economic culture that we live in today and the way it's driving not architecture, but the lack of architecture. Essentially, less architects playing a role in buildings because less money is being spent on architecture. I think read these essays. They're really fascinating because they approach it from a very much a political and cultural point of view that most of us are not talking about. But it's having massive, massive effects on our ability to do our work and to be impactful. Yeah.
Seems like some of the problems are particular to our country, and that it might be useful to sort of see where disciplinary architecture is being built. Like, why is it not being built here?
Right.
Yeah.
Good point.
I agree 100% with that. I think it's great to look at the photos of you pouring the concrete. It's like, if you look like an architect, it's an Italian architect that is working in Brazil, called Lina Bobardi. She was on site directing, almost no drawings. You cannot find some of the drawings of how we pour this on here and then make a wall out of this. I think that what happens also here in America is that it's very codified at one point. Like the drawing is the medium, the code, the drawing, which are necessary, of course. But it also, the architect then becomes one more in the theme of the building, at the building site. Once you go into the building site, there are many people that are there before you, and you know that. And so your role is not that even before you got the project, you lost that in part. In other places, it doesn't have that. There's more direct connection, like you're doing. You paint it, you do it, you cast it, but of course you need regulations, so you process. So in a way, it's true. That's a problem in America, but then no wall is going to fall, your roof is going to be there when you need it. So it's a strange balance of rules and regulations and how the building process here happens, and your relationship as a designer to kind of continues through that. When in the more primitive cultures, I would say Latin America, it would be an older primitive culture, those things are not there yet to stop you from, in a way, advancing to research and inventing.
Maybe we could be more nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot to learn, I think, from what the current situation where buildings are being built. But I think, also, there's a really serious problem. Really, really bad buildings are being built. A lot of them. I don't even know that number Andrew said. I cannot fathom how many buildings that is.
The U.S. Census Bureau does not keep track of that, unfortunately. We should just do it ourselves.
I want to bring up another duality, which is, I think you bring it up as well, which is between building and pedagogy. Because that is something that is very much embedded in American education as a kind of late 19th century model that we are still living through, which is to say that we have disconnected architects from builders. We've put architects inside of institutions such as this one. And at least here, we reconnect again through, I really appreciate Florencia's interpretation of the brief as democratic, but as a way, most of us are practicing architects also teaching, but the teaching culture in the United States hasn't always included a building culture. In fact, it has excluded it for a very long time in order to produce a disciplinary domain, which Andrew has spoken about as a tiny little circle hiding inside of the large behemoth. So could we talk a bit about that? What does it mean? And I kind of point, I'm looking in your direction, you're sitting in front of me, so I can also point at any one of us here at the table. But I think in some ways, I put you into the category of instructors because I do take that kind of etymology of instruction and instructing and being a pedagogue as a builder somewhat seriously, I guess, because in our studio spaces, all we do in a way is miniaturize or simulate or represent those building practices that Dwayne is really actively advocating for. There isn't a one-to-one production in studio of a building, but there is building happening all along. And so maybe those scales of difference could be something that we could talk about. What does it mean to build a pedagogy? What does it mean to build a pedagogy around the action of building or the object of building? And what does that mean for the American context?
You're talking about really 8 to 10 schools out of, how many are there? 100, there used to be 107. I don't know, I think there are more now. Bachelor's programs I'm referring to. Now, don't take, like my argument about building, you don't have to go any further than just like a few miles away to find schools where building is a really important part of the school. And there are not that many interesting ideas floating around.
Oh, come on. Oh, come on. Really, Dwayne?
Yeah.
I think it applies to the census that you found. You can do it in architecture school.
Well, I mean, let's just say,
I don't know.
like, let's say far away, somewhere unknown in the middle.
No names.
I went to school in the middle. There are some good ones and some bad ones. There are some places where building is a really important part of the practice, and nothing interesting is being generated. So this is not an argument for eliminating the pedagogy. Again, it's a negotiation between those two. And I don't think there are very many schools that are negotiating between those two things very well. There's just a constant tug in schools with really smart people to tug in one direction or the other. And we lose sight of what we're doing. I want to say one more, I don't want to get off track, but I want to say one more thing about, in response to what you were saying. I wrote an essay 10, 12 years ago called something like Material Processes and Intimate Understandings. And I really argued for, like, an architect should have an expertise that's based in a material or a process. And the expertise wasn't so much about the technicalities of it, but that with it comes a deep understanding of its resistance, its effects, its sparkle or lack of sparkle, whatever. Very much, kind of where you are with the terracotta. And I won't defend what I wrote anymore. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I don't believe in it. It's that the more I've started practicing, the more I realize that the breadth of things an architect has to take on makes it really difficult to stay focused on that during a lifelong career, and still spend time thinking about the impact of the work on the larger world. We only have so much time in our day and days in our lives, and you have to think, what's going to matter to me. Now, you can think of a few practices where you could say this worked. Maybe Kengo Kuma, maybe Fry Otto, but Fry Otto is mostly arguing, he's not really making architectural arguments. He's making incredible architecture, but it's more a kind of technical experiment, cuckoo stuff. Kengo Kuma is making the argument pretty well, but not very many people have really based their practice in powerful material practices and then became a global practice that impacted the world. Now, there are many who affected places in particular locales, with a kind of critical regionalist approach to material that were really impactful because they were obsessed with certain material or practices. The whole point is to say, I'm so on board. I wish I had the time in my life to try to play with metal and impact the world. I think that those two things it's just, you need more.
But you are playing with metal. You are playing with metal.
No, but I can't. Look, if I.
What are you talking
No,
about?
I'm still going to be.
Hey.
I'm still going to be out in my yard doing, welding stuff in 10 years. But I can't do that and be the architect that I want to be.
No, but this is why I think it's about labor. And I think this is why I think we have a role at understanding how our buildings are going to be made. No? I mean, I think that you might not make it yourself, but you will control what factory is made, like what is your path, I mean, you have Franchetti, you show Franchetti, he had to develop a software that could build this stuff, mm-hmm. and then control the way the software is used by the construction companies. And so you're not shipping out a drawing to be built somewhere in the other side of the world, which happens. So, and you're not building it yourself as a craft either. So right. This is what I wanted to say, like, you can leave the machine, but you cannot also put your hand. It is a conundrum at the level of the construction of your building, because your ideas, no matter how fantastic they are, if they're building at a larger scale, they start to kind of disintegrate in a way. If your building practice is not somehow controlled, that you control that, So, but then you're going to go to the factory every day just to check that it's well done, and that's an issue of scale. So this is what I think labor. Again, I'm going back to Anna. Is you have building and then you have labor. As I know if I say the word craft too many times, Andrew is going to go green. I knew I wanted to put a lot like technique, craft. Because even though he makes soap bricks, out of like recycled plastic, very crafty, but he's not thinking through craft.
Crafty is different.
Yes, crafty. So I agree with you, but that's a problem of the discipline. How our buildings are made.
I mean, I think that Omid, I really like what you're asking, because you're asking also kind of larger kind of economics and the kind of seriousness of the kind of status, the state of things right now for us. And I would say that in some ways, you know, we're showing like whatever 42 slides about a building that's like the size of a, you know, shoebox, and for who, you know what I mean? Like it has almost no impact, will have almost no impact on the greater public, right? Like a total fetishistic exercise in some ways, but at the same time, and it's like in some ways points to a kind of failure of being able to, what does it mean? We have all these skills, we can do anything, like, you know, like registered architect can't, like, how do you become in a position to be able to produce work that will have impact? You know, what does that mean? Certainly, you know, I mean, we talk about all the time, in certain economies where, you know, states actually fund, you know, public projects and actually look towards, you know, creative practices to be able to build that work. That there are places in the world that are like that. So I think that we're very aware of the politics of that. I think that, but I wouldn't. I still think that there is this kind of what we weren't exactly showing, but is this kind of a network of kind of critical and also historical thinking that does ask questions about, you know, who architecture has served, who has made it in the past. So not just about, let's say, us in our hands, but about, let's say, to your point, about, let's say, certainly labor, but also, I mean, we have desires and certainly write about the ways in which architecture exists in the world, separate from the things that we build, right? I mean, that's a whole other kind of part of what does it mean to be thinking about building and how building exists in our built environment as a way of engaging architecture with people, right? Like in some ways, the craft is a way of connecting it to people and economics, right? One can hopefully scale, you know, but I think that, you know, one can scale, yeah, in terms of building or in terms of how thick your book will get over a period of time. Yeah.
Scale, in pedagogy, like teaching, you can't teach to make a building, but maybe I disagree like a little, because I've found strangely that I've learned to care for things at the school. Like you can learn to care for drawing or render or anything. And I found it so applicable to absolutely everything, to care for things. And it seems kind of simple to just sort of, like I'm advocating more buildings that care. And like your practice seems to care a lot about a small detail. And I think that's super impactful actually to a lot of people. Who like are beginning to scale up and are beginning to see that like our small scale teachings here have like big consequences, I think.
Okay, I want to make one more comment. One of my little distinctions and categories, I was saying, things that you look at and things that you think about as two different categories. You know, I remember this was a discussion happening right here with Thomas Demond and Jeff Kipnis, and Jeff was saying, every single time your work is discussed or presented or talked about, it's always explained that it's based on a photograph and it's made by hand out of paper. And if someone didn't know that, what would be the impact of your photographs? And the fact is that, let's assume it was paid by handsomely paid staff or underpaid interns or God knows what. But that was an aspect of it that is important, but it's part that you think about. It's not part that you look at. So the things that you were unpacking in terms of labor is extremely important. And I think a sensitivity to that and a expansion of an understanding of that and a manipulation, a more sensitive manipulation of that is a critical question in architecture. I would argue it largely falls into the category of things that you think about rather than things that you look at. Things that you look at, I'm going to argue, not taking the importance away from things that you think about, but that still becomes the most potent core of architecture's abilities. And the things you think about don't necessarily affect it.
that's how we work as, right? We look at things, and that's what close reading does, right? That's what but that's all part of our, speaking of instructing and instructors and our modalities, right? I mean, your diagram's epic. I love the
No,
I'm
no,
like, yes.
no. I guess this is
like the way you speak is
things that
helps.
are of importance to think about, like how the demand is made, is not the same as the importance of its form.
Really?
I would think so.
How?
You could have made a whole other story that you went to a store at Home Depot and you found all these tiles and you put it up there.
Okay,
And we'd look at it and say, oh. And it wouldn't change. You know what I'm saying? I'm not. Don't take this as a criticism.
No, we're talking.
I'm just talking about that's what I'm saying. Conceptual, but not too much. Like the conceptual part of it is important, but what would happen, and this isn't the way you two practice, and I know your talents and obsessions, but in a lot of circles, that will be a replacement for the things that we look at and the political potency of that form itself as a politics. And I just want to make sure that doesn't get that doesn't get sort of lost in the mix of addressing other things that are necessary to address.
Andrew, I think you would agree, we've never had formalism without technique. The beginning of formalism is an argument about a technique of art, which is to say technique of architecture, it's to say, technique of any art medium as a kind of formalism. So why differentiate material practice from a kind of geometric visualization, a practice of geometric visualization?
No, I'm not. No, I wouldn't. We would say the Blackwing pencil might have been absolutely essential to Quincy Jones' compositions, but I don't need to know that to appreciate the work. For him to have done it, it wouldn't have happened. So I understand that it's important. But that's something, and so it's interesting to think about. In that case, it would be things that you listen to and things that you think about, maybe. Right?
I wonder if it's like the question kind of going back to everything that's on the outside of the camera of the Julia Childs, because I think the issue with, let's say, taking the Blackwing pencil, for example, it's like, yes, on one hand, knowing that they had the Blackwing pencil doesn't change the fact that you can appreciate Jack Jones and like Bugs Bunny and all of the other stuff. But at the same time, knowing the sort of context of the pencil and its relations and its sort of development and how it kind of it made a lot of other things possible, right? It's like, you don't need to know about technologies about knowing about the copy machine, but it's still important, right? Because it connects it to a broader network of things. And I think maybe kind of returning a little bit to the sort of question also on the table about instructors and the sort of role that we play. I was just like looking around at the table and just trying to understand like the things that are kind of in common between all of us. I would say maybe politically we're all socialist Democrats, I'd assume, right? Or some degree of, right? Some degree. I think that there's some shared sort of art background, right? And I think that puts a sort of one-to-one, not the separation of the sort of object from the thing that's getting constructed. But then also the insistence on a sort of education that is not so narrowly focused, but one that understands education as like a set of values and not only a set of looking at things, but also a way of thinking about the thing that we're making and the way that thing exists in the world. And I think that is like, we could teach building as building, and I can kind of go and teach a set how to do a permit package, right? I could teach like all of those things, but at the same time, the sort of value that we bring as instructors and we bring to the students is a way of kind of thinking about the world through the things that you're actually creating and what that impact is, right? And so that's where the sort of maybe it's not just looking at things; it is thinking about it as well. And I think that that is the sort of really fundamental component to us as instructors.
There was a question.
Yeah.
David, if you're still interested in asking. You have a microphone.
Yeah, well, this actually, I think
There's
you
one
guys
more
were-
question.
Yeah,
then bring it back,
I'll
bring
keep
it
it
back,
short
bring it back.
because I think you actually were addressing it, and I say this like as a friend, colleague, family, all of you. I was thinking as you guys were presenting, like if I saw that there was a symposium about building at almost any other school, or even on the internet, I would think today the conversation would be about buildings impacts on resource extraction, on social relationships, like things really embedded in the world. And I was struck that, of course, that's not exactly where we're all coming from. And I think really what I'm hearing maybe has to do with creativity surrounding our practice on building, which I guess I'm curious if you guys could maybe expand on your own positions of the sense that today it becomes increasingly, there's a sense to put that position under attack, or at least under a microscope, that buildings and the authorship of buildings should not be where creativity should be happening. It should be happening elsewhere, maybe in relations of labor only, relations of material extraction, building performance, how a practice is structured and organized, labor, et cetera. And I think you guys touched actually in some of the presentations on the web between, authorial creativity and some of that stuff. But I'm just kind of curious because I do think that is where sometimes discussions about, quote unquote discipline and these things that we maybe care about fall on deaf ears in the outside world, or maybe today in other formats. Maybe it has to do with the fact that feels so narrow when there's all this other stuff that when we're talking about buildings, really is impactful to 99.99% of people. I'm curious, where should we stand today on authorial creativity, the sort of design eye, the idea of making our own terracotta tiles, of drawing buildings to make something new, for the ambition for global impact, that what we're doing should or could even have that kind of impact, in relationship to maybe these questions of maybe ethics and actually constructing buildings or constructing practices. Maybe that's a really broad question, I don't know. But I feel like that's maybe a little bit to some of maybe what he's asking as well. How do we confront the kind of problem that we're invested in a school like SCI-Arc, which has to do with creativity surrounding architecture, and of course creativity at our desk as individuals in relationship to all this stuff that is so important and loud right now, that is often asking for actually less imagery, less formalism, less creativity there, and creativity maybe in a slightly other part of practice.
I would like to answer.
Please.
I will try. Don't judge me. And I wanted to follow on something you just said. I want to go back to this idea of democracy. We have to be democratic thinkers. Formalism, non-formalism, it doesn't matter. The one thing that matters is the value that things will have. So let's talk about value. You just put the word value. So what is value? So Andrew just said, what is the difference if you didn't tell the story when you presented, you brought one brick and you brought it, no mentioning, no description. You brought two bricks. One, you made it perfectly, and the other one is from Home Depot. To us, they're the same, no? They're exactly the same. So the judgment, I would say the judgment on the piece would be on pure form, or maybe just simply on the object itself. But what you have to judge is the value of each one of them. For example, if I bring $200 bills, so they are exactly the same, but I run it through the value system of my machine, and then this is the real one, this is the fake one. So that means that they're the same, but one doesn't have value. So again, where is the value to what you're talking about? Social value, ecological value, and so on. The value, and the same thing goes to fast fashion, it goes to fast food. The value is in deep down the thing itself. So if you tell me that the mat you use is a mat that you found in a responsible source, that almost like the brick has a story. This other brick, if you go deep down, what is the value of that brick, does not have the same story. It's like actually it was shipped. The carbon emissions were huge, and blah, 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 blah. Both your building bricks are exactly identical, yet one has value and the other one not. So I do think that when we teach the students and we work through, we have to understand the value of things and then discuss that, or debate that or find. This is why I think, again, the value might be in design through that. But once you start to kind of look down deep into the processes and so on, I think it makes a difference if it was made out of paper or not. For Mr. Lemon. Where did he source the paper? How many trees did he kill?
I think that's a beautiful comment to end on, if you agree, because we're way past since. Value is perfect. Value.
You didn't ask do we need creativity?
I think we do. I'm curious how you answer
That's
that.
the basis of why you're here. It's the basis of the profession. It's just thinking out things in specific ways that are relevant in the broader conversation you're having to do with Ed and your discipline and practice is finding an alignment with the general public. And I mean at a global level, general public. Right? And if you don't have the alignment, you don't have a job. And so if you don't get in the ring, Theodore Roosevelt said really clearly, you're not really that angry. You're an architect, you build buildings. The argument about the Levius argument was 50 years ago, and we were defending Levius. You build buildings, you're an architect. If you do not build buildings, you're something else. You're a researcher, you're an academic, what do you want to call it? You're not an architect. You build buildings, you engage. Right? And the engagement changes everything. It changes the way you answer all these questions. Right? It starts with dealing with ornamentation. You're parallel to that. Right? And it starts with constraints. And if you can't deal with constraint, you don't have openness to having the ability, the creative ability to continually connect the dots, move something forward, having to do with your personal, political, social, cultural sensibility, which is now a private conversation, right? And those that want it, and if you are engaged, your architecture is engaged in day-to-day activity. It has to be so that it takes place in our day-to-day lives. And you're, depending on your personality, you either are interested in shaping it, and changing it, and altering it, and expanding it, or you're not. And that's another personal conversation. That's not a, you'll all come to that degree. Not that many people, honestly, really want to shape or shape it in a radical way. Now you yourself find architects that are interested in shaping a certain way. You can be interested in that. And by nature, it doesn't work that way. People still are engaged in more technology, but just solving complex problems. It's funny, I was thinking you're really like the omelet. I would have altered the omelet with the technology that does cardiac surgery that now change people do, I think, called ablation, complicated operation aorta, where 10 years ago they would cut you
Yeah.
and you'd be in the hospital because there is no omelet in architecture. There isn't any omelet ever dealt with from the beginning. It's an omelet. It already starts at the technology, the microsurgery of and to connect what things you're asking. If you're interested in tectonic and the processes and materials, you have to add something to them. Otherwise, nobody needs you. You're going to be entering places that was really interesting because it's some of the same. The ceramics, et cetera, and ditto with the steel, et cetera. Some of that's 19th century. It's been going on in the last 25 years, post-digital. It's all really ramped up. To get even where they are is a huge leap, right? And to be valuable, you have to through your own kind of creative thinking and seeing it from a different perspective, from their more narrow thinking, what you is within that discipline, you somehow alter things and somehow change things and invent something. That's what you need. Otherwise, they don't need it, right? It's going to be a huge effort just to catch up, to understand the nature of those things. Like this vector is super, super complicated. It's a dynamic material. It's not, it moves, it changes over time. And if it's affected by temperature, it's affected by absorption, moisture, etc. It's a really super complex thing. But they've been working on it
For a long time.
5, 6, 7 years. Yeah. And so the
More.
first thing is to kind of catch up, right? And then probably most of you here, if you end up being interested in that, it's no longer, architecture still seen like GP, like this general medicine, it doesn't work that way. Highly special. And it'll end up being with somebody researching that, and you're going to be doing scans, or you're going to be doing material research, or et cetera. And it does take huge amount of concentration. These are very complex things. And again, the digital really ramps up. Because those processes change dramatically, right? And the problem is no longer a person. Tom Farage was in my slide 50 years ago. Yeah. I've been there, done that, and it was Tom. And he came out of here. And he's doing this with a person. There's no person in it. We have the tallest steel building in China. It's a 300-meter building. It's all done robotic. Right? And it's all done for the same drawings come out of our studios. So the drawings you're doing are the construction drawings. So it's directly from our 3D drawings. Anyway.
So the answer is yes. Yes to creativity. I know, but I asked these guys.
Well, no, it's nice to have the response.
Yes.
I mean,
Of course, yes. How do you articulate that?
I mean, one thing that, Tom, you mentioned is that if you're an architect, of course you build. And I think, of course, we would all agree. The thing is that not all of us are architects. Professionally speaking, nobody's an architect when they graduate from the school. Everybody is a student with a degree in architecture. And it takes us into different practices and different modalities. This is kind of why we're all here at this table. And so the omelet is really just a metaphor to say that it's all omelet. We're all just breaking some eggs, right? It's
Something I've been kind of completely, totally absorbed this about 3 years now. It hasn't been a good thing. It seems they lead to some other question. Why are so many of the brightest people coming out of the academic world that come out of school end up going into the academic world and not practicing? It seems to me, I think it is one of the most relevant questions today in the professional process. That I look at my generation, I look at now that I'm here to listen to you guys. I live out. I'm totally interested in what's going on. And some of it is very particular to this country, because we're in a kind of a radical down curve of cultural understanding of something going on. But it seems to have to be a huge amount of discussion. So if I'm just going to say you have to build buildings, and yet it seems like a lot of the brightest characters aren't going into that. What's this? Because I'm trying to think if I was you. I'm going to go, I don't care about calling an architect. I don't give a shit about being called an architect. I'm going to do whatever I'm doing that uses my intelligence a certain way. It goes back to drawing, research, whatever it is. I'm going to kind of adjust my project, do something that's going to be, it'll come down in history, it'll show up on some sort of curve that suddenly took place over a certain set of decades. That it seemed like the most interesting ideas, the most compelling kind of thinking was taking place here and not through the building group or something. But it seems to be one of the really huge kind of issues today. And because all of us, you mentioned that we talk about all the time, are suffering with just getting work. Just this surviving is the problem in this culture, right? And there's just about no product coming out of this country in terms of the agreement in this game. There's not much creative, there's not much kind of product that comes out of it that represents an interesting kind of architecture that's at all compelling at kind of many levels, right? And you wonder what's going on, right? Why that's taking place. And part of it would be, you were because some of the discussion does include political, cultural, social, some interest in engagement with the world. It says architects do this or that, and it's definitely not about to look at something. Forget that. Funny, you mentioned, again, you can answer this differently if you're practicing and struggling with that. You mentioned drawings and rhetoric. The thing that wasn't said, you'll find out really soon. You never draw with that interest what it is. It's strategic. You draw it to get someplace, to be closer to having a conversation with law students. I can talk to my son, who just came out of law school. He completely understands. I have to make a drawing for X client, and it's drawings that look like this. And I'm not going to show much ability. I'm going to do something. Because I'm trying to go here, and I've got to move somebody there, and the object of the drawing is to be useful to me to move the project forward. It has nothing to do with what's like at all. That's a complete misunderstanding. In fact, the more personal it is to you, the closer you are to it in terms of its own values, the more private it is. By nature, we're stuck. We're not sculptors. We're not painters. We have people that are on the service of solving some problem, right? And the look is much more your ability. And if anything, you don't show the problem. First thing you learn is you show nothing, and you only talk about pragmatics, and then you slide the whole thing in without ever talking about it, right? And it'd be really an important conversation why you draw, right? Other than your own personal drawings, or if you need drawings, that's another one question. Introduce your own creative process, right? But after that, if you're showing it to somebody, it seems like it wouldn't be possible in that institution.
One thing, Tom, one thing is that everyone here in this room, if there's a takeaway for the students, is that everybody's practicing architecture, perhaps at different scales. That's the whole point, right? That there isn't an academic architect, as you say, who isn't practicing. Everyone here is practicing, but I think the scales are different. And to David's question about ethics, practicing and scaling in an ethical way is very difficult today. To throw a project from a backyard into another country, into another political space, is a question that has to be ethical. And our generation, I think, is trying to understand how that scaling will work in a kind of politically engaged way. So it's very difficult to make some of those shifts, but it's not about a kind of a lack of practice, as we have seen today, I think, from the presentations. You wanted to say that?
Yeah, what I can say just to entering the school, and I'm very, very pleased to see, first of all, an atlas of different scales, for example. I'm also very pleased to see that the school doesn't have one kind of faculty that understands architecture in one way. On the contrary, it's an atlas. I think you have more and more differences. You want to try to get together, I understand empathy. But those differences make diversity grow and make the school richer and make the cake and the table bigger. So I'm completely on board on this, and I have a lot of hope after only 4 weeks being here. I agree with you, Tom, 98%. It's really true. I also do this with the clients. I show drawings that show the agenda, but not what is it. So I'm with you 100%. But the architect, as the school has an atlas, the architect has an atlas as well. And architects can operate doing stage design, designing an event, designing cakes, working with Ferran Adrià in the cuisine, and doing buildings. And I hope we have public space and landscape and infrastructure. Oh, nice, I like that. And the atmosphere. So I'm very glad to see not confrontation, but on the contrary, this kind of map. But yeah, I do have a question, which I think you're absolutely right. We as a school, being, and I make myself we as part of the school, being such a creative engine, speculative, innovative, and so on, and being construction, the #1 economy in the world, 28% of our global GDP. You know, real estate is 7, agriculture is 11, and construction is 28. It's the biggest economy in the world. So can we align, and it's back to the idea of alignment you were saying, can we align a school with this creativity and innovation with this real ground, but not architecture buildings, but rather atlas of solutions to all of this? This will be my call for the students who are learning the thesis here today, that if they could really use and empower the school to
You're
that.
speaking to an infrastructural logic, which is to say there is a kind of global almost reach.
There is an ethical performance by our school, because a lot of people are watching what we do and a lot of schools are following what we do. I understand from you that you would like the school to be more addressing buildings. I understand that other disciplines are architecture as well and formats. So let's continue blending the silos of academia and profession. Let's continue blending the circles as you are doing with your dots. Let's continue engaging with you, Tom, absolutely. Great questions. You are extremely right. There's so much terrible buildings out there in Spain, in Barcelona, not only. So thank you. I would just want to say thank you to be here.
Keeping asking questions, more declarative, this is what it is. This level of experience, like when you talked about, Florencia, about architecture, is it architecture or sculpture art? I was expecting you to say no. It's spatial and it accommodates some human activity, it's not architecture.
There you go. I told you, police, architecture police.